welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Turn the Page, the Syosset Library podcast. My name is Barney Levantino, and I am happy today to welcome our guest, Kim Wickens. Kim, welcome.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And your new book, the book is Lexington, and I have to confess right up front that when it was presented to me initially, I was thinking, I don't know, a book about a horse, I'm not quite sure about this one. However, I will tell you that this is just an absolutely fascinating read on just so many levels. So, having said that, just tell our audience very briefly what the book is about, and then we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty.
All right, okay. This is a book about a 19th century racehorse who ran in the antebellum era in what was then the hotbed of horse racing, which was New Orleans. And, a lot of people today, we think of Kentucky, New York, California as the racing venues, which that's true for today. But back then, it very much was the city of New Orleans, which was just the perfect place to host, horse racing events with all of the lively activity that was going on there in that era, even then. And
it was amazing. I'm just going to interrupt you. At one point, you're bringing up New Orleans, and it was amazing to me that a city of that size at that time was supporting three racetracks within the city, and then a fourth one on the other side of the river. It's just mind-boggling that there was
it truly was that they had that much interest and that much financial support to be able to host that many racing venues. Back then, horses ran races that were 4-mile heats. I mean, not every horse could run a 4-mile heat. Some horses were running 1-mile heats, 2 all the way up to 4 being the top echelon of racing back then. But essentially these horses in these heat races, they would run heats consisting of, if it was a 1-mile heat race, they would run a mile, they would then rest for a certain period of time, and then they would go back out and do it again. And they kept doing these various levels of heats until at least one horse won 2 heats. So theoretically, you could have a heat race that would go on for 3 or 4 different heats. I mean, just mind-boggling. And so, really, of course, the top, the top level then was the 4-mile heat racing. That would be what we would consider in racing terms today a grade 1 stakes race. Top.
And New Orleans is not exactly a cool, dry climate to be running, 4-mile races one after the other. And when you think about it nowadays, the Belmont Stakes at 1.5 miles is considered a really, really long race. So it's just amazing how I guess it's the breeding that has changed in terms of what they're looking for in horses. And I'm now going to get into the beginning of your book. You start right off, and for somebody like me who really doesn't know much about horses other than, which is the front and which is the back, you start off explaining Bottom, which for me kind of put everything in perspective, and explain that a little bit to our listeners.
It was a very interesting term. And when I was researching the book, I kept running across the term bottom, B-O-T-T-O-M, bottom. And, there never really was this exact definition of what bottom was, other than it seemed to imply that bottom pertained to stamina, strength, courage. It really was a broadly encompassing term. It meant everything that was the soul, basically the soul of the horse, that enabled the horse to really dig deep within itself to overcome these fantastic, strenuous racing tests that they were subjected to back then. So Bottom encompassing strength, courage, stamina, all of those in order to get the job done, so to speak.
Again, being a neophyte, I'm looking at it in terms of the horses that were running back then versus the really horses running more sprint races now. And the closest analogy I drew is I'm a baseball fan, and I look at the way pitchers are treated nowadays, whereas 25, 30, 40 years ago, it was not uncommon for these guys to go 9, 10, 11, 12 innings if necessary. Nowadays, you have pitchers that are throwing 4 innings, maybe 5, and then you're bringing in all the relievers. So it shows how the very nature of the athlete and the performance that's expected of the athlete has changed in 150 years or so.
That is such a really great analogy, and it's so true, I think, across the board, because even in that the prologue where I'm talking about bottom, I even bring up this, even boxing at that time, and I talk about the Yankee, the one of the fights with George Morrissey, I can't recall the exact name, Yankee Sullivan, and back then they were battling, bare knuckles for some crazy length of like 27 rounds, just amazing. Insane. It was, and you're exactly right. It was the level of stamina, not just for the horse athlete, but for all, across the board. And you're absolutely right. I think as time progresses, we definitely see a change in athletes of all stripes.
At the time, we're talking now 1850s, pre-Civil War. I guess the spectator sport market was really limited. You had boxing, you had horse racing, and much beyond that, there wasn't a lot. You didn't really have professional baseball yet. You didn't have pro football. You had some college football, but it really wasn't that big of an activity. So that might explain not only the level of interest in a city like New Orleans, but nationwide. And now I'm thinking about the specifics of Lexington's career and the hype that surrounded the races that he was running. Talk a little bit now about specifically about Lexington, who he was, what was special about him.
Well, first of all, Lexington was obviously one of these horses that had the ability, had the bottom, if you will, that he could run the very top 4-mile heat races. What made him so interesting, and it was kind of like, for me, the asterisk, on this horse in terms of his great ability and his great courage, was that he was not born this way, but at some point in his career, he starts to lose his vision. And so that's in the book, and in terms of how he lost his vision and possibly what the causes were that brought that on. However, this adds, in addition to just the strenuous, these strenuous 4-mile heats that these horses are running. In Lexington's case, he also had to deal with the recurring bouts of the inflammation of the eyes. And in some cases, he was not even able to race. He had to be withdrawn because his vision was so badly impaired at that time. And then once his vision would clear up just a little bit, he would then be entered into another race. But during all of this inflammation of the eyes coming and going, it did impact his right eye so badly that he was blinded in that right eye. And so during almost the entirety of his racing career, which was cut short after 7 races because he was going completely blind by then, but he was running essentially all of those races blind in one eye. So it was just another level of something this horse had to overcome to accomplish these grand feats that he.
It just speaks to the fortitude of this animal. Yeah. It's just amazing that he just kept on going. And in addition to Lexington as a primary character in this book, it's populated by just a group of just really interesting, colorful, really compelling figures. The owners, the trainers. Talk a little bit about some of the important people in racing back then.
His Lexington had 2 primary owners. And so the first half of the book focuses on Richard Tenbrook, who is a native of Albany, New York. And he has a very colorful history of how he ends up in horse racing. Essentially being kicked out of West Point, possibly, or choosing to leave West Point on his own. We're not really sure. However, the circumstances weren't great surrounding that departure. And he basically is cast off from his family and left to fend for himself, basically.
And his family was they were a very, very prominent New York political,
a very prominent family in Albany.
Family.
Correct. Helped found, Albany essentially. And he was left to his own devices and eventually falls into the world of horse racing. And he is such a horse racing impresario that he can basically talk his way and convince people of anything, and has a great amount of foresight as well. And so he comes into ownership of the Metairie Racecourse in New Orleans, and he's a racehorse promoter. He's a racehorse promoter, he's a racecourse promoter, and is trying to bring as many people as he can into the venue of the Metairie, and not just people from New Orleans, but everywhere. He wants everyone everywhere to come to his track. And so he conceives of this great race, the Great State Post race, and he decides that the horses competing should be from various states across the nation. And he then goes in search of a horse to represent the state of Kentucky, ends up purchasing what was then named Darley, the horse Darley, and then renames him Lexington in order to race for the state of Kentucky. And so Tin Brook basically owns the horse through his entire racing career. And then he switches hands after he's retired from racing due to blindness. He then switches hands into a man by the name of Robert Aitchison Alexander, who's starting a breeding farm in Midway, Kentucky, and purchases Lexington in order to stand as his primary stallion to start the breeding venue. And today this may sound like, horse breeding. We know that this happens in Kentucky, and this is just something that we've known happens for quite some time. But Robert Aitchison Alexander's view was very visionary, because at that time you may have had stud farms, but they really were not for mass market sell. These were just people that stood a stallion, and maybe some turf guys would come in and bring their mares there and then breed a horse and then have that horse specifically for their stable. But what Mr. Alexander envisioned was something grander and really opening it up for everybody, so that anyone who ever wanted, could purchase a horse, possibly to run for their dreams, and also he would breed horses and then sell breed horses to his own mares, and then he would then sell the product at auctions, which again, auctions were unheard of at that time. Now, of course, we know of the Keeneland auction sales, Fasig-Tipton auction sales, but at that time, they did not exist in America. And so he really was the driving force behind all of that in American history here for horse racing.
You mentioned it, the Great State Post race, which was the first big race that was promoted. And again, I'm thinking to the hype surrounding that race, the hype surrounding Lexington's subsequent races against his primary rival at the time, I guess, was Lecomte. And I think back to my age, I was about 15 when Secretariat ran for the Triple Crown. In fact, I was at Belmont that day. I grew up in Belmont.
Oh, wow.
I lived on the south side of town. The track was up there, and we used to go up every now and then, and we were there that day. And I'm thinking of just the pulse of everything that was going on then. And that's the sense that I get from reading about the public's excitement about these races involving Lexington, Lecomte, Lexington's race, not only against other horses, but the race against time. Talk about that one, which is also fascinating.
I love the race against time. In fact, that was one of the very first chapters I wrote. I wrote the book pretty much in the order of time, but I took that particular chapter and wrote it first because I was really fascinated by that race. And basically, so Lexington has been racing against his nemesis, this horse named Lecomte, and Lecomte breaks an American speed record during one of these races with Lexington. And of course, at that time, you have all of this bravado, all of this I'm going to challenge your horse to a rematch and so forth by Tim Brooke and then the owner of Lecomte, TJ Wells. And so there's all of this going back and forth. And the owner of Lecomte refuses to rematch his horse against Lexington. And so Tim Brooke did the next best thing. And he basically challenged the horse to run against time itself, against the record that Lecomte had just broken. And it was really fascinating because that was the very first race in American history ever, a horse against a constant, no other horse, just a horse against a constant. And that had never been done in American history. And so there was, of course, was just a tremendous amount of press over this, and all of these pundits saying it could not be done, it's impossible, you just can't do it, it's not going to happen. And even if you do, you have all of these things you're going to have to contend with, and he might be able to match Lecomte's time, but probably not. And there's all of this going back and forth, just incredible doubt that this can be done. And in fact, the horse did face tremendous challenges in the race itself and then leading up to the race against time. And that was, to me, that was just so fascinating. When I wrote it, I wanted to kind of make time more like a competitor because, it really was his competitor. And so I really tried to play up that aspect of time being an actual competitor, in the race. And they did capitalize time back then as in a competitor, and so to me, it really was the competitor.
And again, I'm thinking back to that afternoon at Belmont when Secretariat was running 30 some odd lengths ahead of the field. And you get the sense that horse was just running. I'm going to just go as fast as I can here and do the best I can. And he did the same. He was on there. Yeah. It was really remarkable. And these, and we think of them as animals. They really are athletes. And it's just amazing that they have this sense of a desire just to really excel. It really is truly a fascinating look at these creatures.
Yeah, and it's so true. I mean, I think one of the comments that I put in the book that I really liked was by the 19th century historian Charles Trevethan, and he was there, or he was present, or maybe it wasn't him, it was another one, but this historian was present at the final race of Lexington and saw the horse, there in the crowd and after the race. And he made the comment that he has complete, the horse had complete ability to comprehend. He felt that the horse was fully aware of what was happening and his placement there. And he said, the historian goes on to say, how dare us presumptuous mortals to assume that such an animal has no soul, and it's so true. I think these animals do understand.
Now, another confession, when I read the chapter where Lexington is passing, and I was choked up reading it. It really was touching to read about his passing and the way he did. It was just bringing a tear to my eye. It was well written and well conveyed. So I commend you on that one.
Thank you.
I had made a note to myself when I was thinking about this discussion that the story has so many different levels and different characters in it. And I made a note that you had heroes, you had gracious winners, you had sore losers, you had villains, you had the bandits. You had this all going on. Now the Civil War happens, and you essentially have guerrilla warfare throughout the Kentucky countryside. And these people who have previously, I guess, been involved in a somewhat genteel business of horse breeding and horse racing are now dealing with this just horrific bands of marauders going through the countryside. So let's talk about that a little bit as well.
Okay. Kentucky, being a border state then, was torn and really divided. And the citizens of Kentucky, I mean, you were not Union all the way, you were not Southern all the way. I mean, you had a very divided group of people. And so, of course, it became just open ground, basically, for lawlessness in so many ways. And even though the Union was stationed there by Abraham Lincoln, they really were not doing a very effective job of protecting the people of Kentucky. And, there's room for discussion as to why that was. However, the belief, at least by George Prentice, the editor of the Louisville Daily Journal, was because the general that Lincoln had put into Kentucky to watchdog over Kentucky was just really a tyrant and was not being very effective as a leader. And so George Prentice is trying to conceive of a way to get the word across to Lincoln that he just really needs to replace the guard here in Kentucky, and he needs to do something different about that. And so at the time, because Kentucky was so divided and not very watched over in terms of the Union doing their job effectively, there were all of these guerrilla bands, these Confederate guerrilla bands and various factions that were just running roughshod all over Kentucky and basically taking, stealing and taking valuables, whether it's gold or silver or jewelry or horses. They were stealing from everywhere for their own personal gain for the most part. And so you had all of these factions that were just roaming all over Kentucky, taking whatever they wanted. And out of the rise of this, out of all of this comes this guerrilla. This is one of my favorite persons to write about, because how could you not enjoy writing about this very complex individual by the name of Marcellus Jerome Clark? And so Marcellus Jerome Clark was this young kid who was out of the the Second Kentucky Cavalry, the Confederate soldiers. And basically, when that band kind of busts up, all of these guys are left to fend for themselves. And so Marcellus Jerome Clark starts his own band, which becomes this guerrilla band. And this kid is kind of like this androgynous type guy. It's a guy that he doesn't have facial hair. He has very long hair that's these gorgeous, beautiful brown curls. And he has kind of like a very slim figure. And so he passes himself off, supposedly, according to some historical accounts, as a woman in certain circumstances. And he did this in order to be able to infiltrate the Union side and to gather intelligence and so forth. But there really is testimony out there by individuals who knew him that they really questioned, is this a guy or is this a woman? And so during one of these incidents where, they're robbing a stagecoach, he and his fellow companions, the word gets back to George Prentice, and he's so fascinated by this individual who historians believe that George Prentice did know the true identity of this individual, and that it was Marcellus Jerome Clark, but chose instead of identifying him for who he was, chose to create this fictional woman guerrilla in order to embarrass the Union and to get word back to Abraham Lincoln that, hey, you have this woman guerrilla, which in that era, a woman guerrilla that's terrorizing Kentucky and the Union can't do anything about her. So you have this going on, and really the sole aim of that whole thing was to convince President Lincoln to do something different. And so everything that Jerome Clark did basically was characterized by George Prentice as Sue Mundy. And that's what he named Jerome Clark, is Sue Mundy. Sue Mundy has now done this. Sue Mundy has now stolen these horses and so forth. And so really she became just this villain, and everyone thought of Sue Mundy as a woman up until the very end.
If you invented that as a fictional character in a story about this, it would be, this is a little bit too far-fetched. But the reality of it is just, it's one more aspect of this whole story, which is just compelling and fascinating. It's just incredible that this is real stuff. You can't talk about this whole situation and the time frame, and you're talking about the Civil War without really addressing the way race played into this. Race with a capital R, not horse race, but race and racial relations. And what's interesting is, you have the owners, you have the breeders who are all white guys, rich, wealthy white guys. And a lot of the trainers, a lot of the jockeys, a lot of them were slaves. And, there's that part of it. I mean, you have one jockey in particular, they said that, his life was really, really terrific. He was getting paid a lot of money for riding the horses, but he was still somebody else's property. And it's just, yeah.
Yeah, Abe Hawkins, and he was the writer of Lecomte. And yes, I mean, so all of the history at that time, and I was shocked to learn this when I was reading it and learning about it, is that these black horsemen, whether they were freed or enslaved, most of them were enslaved. They were so coveted for their skills because they had these great skills that they had learned doing plantation work, whatever it was. They had developed a great skill being able to take care of and train and then jockey these horses. And so they were highly coveted, and they were in fact paid most of the time very well. And so an individual like Abe Hawkins, who received large sums of money to ride, but was also, the national press, would talk about him, because a lot of these black horsemen and jockeys were unnamed, so you would read the race reports and you would see Gilpatrick, the white jockey, listed beside a certain horse. And then you would just see the name John written beside another horse. And we don't have a last name for John because he's a black enslaved man, or you would see, not even a name at all, just Cornelius or nothing at all, just an unnamed jockey. And that was the treatment, sometimes that was the disdain, I guess, that was just given to these very talented men. But in the case of Abe Hawkins, he did receive recognition and press coverage because he was so very talented at what he did. But even that, and he was an enslaved man at the time that he was writing Lecomte. Even with the press recognizing him and so forth, he still came very much under all of the pressures of slavery. And there's an episode in the book where there's a questionable thing that happened to the racehorse Lecomte, and was he drugged or was he really ill? At a certain point in his career, a drug meaning intentionally drugged in order to fail. And then the owner, doesn't look at anything except the jockey. Well, the jockey, Abe Hawkins, this was his doing. He's the guy that brought down this horse. And so there were very much all of these various atrocities that these men, even though they were recognized in certain circumstances, and even though they were paid fairly well, especially for black men of that era, they were still slaves. They were still enslaved people and pretty much treated that way.
Yeah, and again, you can't read the story without addressing that aspect of it, and it's just horrible in terms of what they were dealing with on that level. And in some ways, I mean, the animals were treated more, treated better, and they were more valuable.
Yes. Yeah, certainly. I mean, a horse could be sold for more than a man. And that's a very sad thing to think about.
Legacies. What is Lexington's legacy now, 100 and some odd years down the pike?
Okay, so this horse becomes this fantastic sire. And sire, not every racehorse can go on to be a fantastic sire. Secretariat, for example, was not really regarded as a fantastic sire. But this horse was not only a great racehorse, but became just this phenomenal sire. And a lot of that, you could question why was that? Did he have these great genes that he was able to pass down? But two, I mean, you can look at Robert Alexander, the breeder that stood him at Woodburn Farm, and the practices that he employed. And he really, really made an effort to try to only breed horses to Lexington, or mares to Lexington, that could be a good match for him, where these mares had certain qualities by their dam and their sire, that these qualities combined with Lexington's stamina and his speed could create a really great racehorse. And that type of judicial crossing that Alexander employed really did bring about all of these superstar horses that some of them are talked about in the book, Asteroid and Kentucky, and some of these really phenomenal horses that then went on to race right after Lexington. And so Lexington, his blood, it can be seen. And I give a list at the end. I mean, you're talking about the first 10 or 20 years of the Kentucky Derby were won by horses, from his direct lineage. If they weren't his sons or daughters, they were within 1 to 2 generations from him. And the same goes for the Belmont, and then the Preakness and the Saratoga Cup and the Travers and so forth. You could just go down the line and start looking at all of these horses that can trace back to him in what they would call tell-mel, meaning a very direct lineage. And so as we get further in time, that's going to be diluted. But if you were to go back and look at all of these pedigrees, I was just astounded when I started looking at the pedigrees of all of these famous horses today, and the Seabiscuits and the Man of War and so forth. And I was just astounded how many times Lexington did appear in their pedigrees. And every time he appears in a pedigree is called a cross. And there was just so many crosses in these horses. It's just phenomenal. Now, is his blood really heavy? No. It's been diluted so much, but he's there in the pedigrees of so many horses. And when I started this, I commissioned the Jockey Club to just look at the past 20 years and to only look at graded stakes winning horses. So we're now talking about a very small percentage of horses in a 20-year period. And to give me an idea how many of those horses had crosses of Lexington in them. And I'm under contract with them not to disclose that in all circumstances, but I can let you know that the list that they gave me, because I printed it off, they emailed it to me, the list that they gave me is a single named, you have a sheet of paper with just a single name on every single line. And we're talking about reams and reams and reams of paper of names of horses, that have Lexington in the blood. And, it was just astounding to me. And when I was talking to a bloodstock agent, to try to get some idea how to relate this, in the book, and he basically said, well, look, all of these Northern Dancer, Mr. Prospector, all of these big horse names that we know of in our modern age that have really become the foundational sires for the modern thoroughbred, those horses would not exist without Lexington.
That speaks not only to Lexington himself in terms of his genetic makeup, but it also speaks to the foresight and the vision of R.A. Alexander in really establishing his breeding program. And it speaks to the really the legacy of Woodburn Farm, which was his right. His estate, and the confluence of the horse, the breeder, the race promoter, it just everything coming together at that particular time really tells just really a riveting, interesting story. Again, I'm coming at this completely out of the horse world, but it really drew me in, and it's just a terrific story, and it's well presented. And again, I commend you for that. I have to ask you one other question. Again, this is kind of going a little bit afield, but as I was reading the book, we're also reading stories nowadays about what seems to be an inordinate number of racetrack deaths.
Yes.
For these current horses. So if you can speak to that, or if not, what's going on here? Is it more, or are we hearing about it more? I'm guessing that these horses have sufficient value that people are trying to take care of them.
Yes. And I speak to you as a fan, a horse racing fan. I'm not an insider. I don't talk to breeders and jockeys and trainers and know what is being done in the moment, or what are the factors that they are considering. But as a horse racing fan who loves the sport, who loves thoroughbred horses, clearly, I mean, these things are very troubling. I mean, not just for the animals themselves, but for the individuals, the jockeys, men, women that are actually on these horses, and the dangers that it can create for them if they're riding an unsound animal. And I don't know the answer to that in terms of if we're just hearing about this more and this has always been going on, or if something is happening now that is making it more prevalent. There's been some talk about the racetrack surfaces, and that's something I discuss a lot in the book, is the racetrack surfaces, and whether we need to make everything synthetic tracks, which is more responsive to the animal's ligaments and bones, and so forth, instead of making it so harsh, for them to run. Or, here in America, we run in an oval. In England, it's a straight path. They're not having to make turns, all the time, and so forth. Maybe the age of the horses, need to be older, before they start running. I mean, there's all of these factors that we can look at and say, what is it? Is it the breeding? Is it the racetrack surfaces? Is it medications that are being used that shouldn't be used? And I think that, and my hope would be, since this is America's first sport and it's such a grand sport, that I would hope that the people who have the stewardship of taking care of the sport now can do something to help it improve and to help it continue, right? Safely, for the animals and for the people and for the sporting fans like myself that want to watch it. And I think measures are being taken. I mean, again, I speak as a fan, not an insider. The act that's with the Congress right now to try to make everything more uniform, instead of having different rules and in different states where a violation here is not being reported to this state over here, and so forth. And those things create, I think, a lot of problems and a lot of ways for people to get around things. And so if we had more uniformity in the way things are done, I think that would certainly help out a lot. I speak as a fan, not an insider, not someone who has all of the knowledge of what exactly is going on today behind the scenes.
Understood, but I had to inquire. The book is Lexington, Kim Wickens. It is just absolutely an interesting, just entertaining, fascinating read. The story of this horse and the people around him and his times is just really, really just amazing. Something I was just completely unaware of. It's a wonderful read. Part of what we do here is we like to promote authors and books. And on the subject, we're talking about Lexington. And I kind of have to throw in, for our fiction readers as well, a little shout out to Geraldine Brooks for her book, Horse, which is a fictionalized version of Lexington's story. So I would recommend to our listeners, pick up both. And absolutely,
I've read Horse, by the way, and I loved it. So
it's terrific. But yeah, I started reading it after I finished your book. So
it's a great book.
And your book is terrific. It really wonderful. You have anything on the horizon? You're working on something new yet, or not really?
Oh yeah, they started me right away. My agent started me right away. We have some ideas we're looking into that are very different and not horse related. So already looking into something else.
We will look forward to that as well. Thank you so much for spending some time today. It really has been interesting. The book is wonderful. Kim Wickens, Lexington, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. And with that, we will turn the page on this chapter of our podcast.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.